Hello everyone and welcome to the webinar. Cecilia from the NCBFA Educational Institute, and I'd like to thank you for joining us for today's presentation. Before we get started, I would like to mention a couple of housekeeping items. As always, all attendees are in listen-only mode. However, you can submit questions anytime by typing them into the question box on the webinar toolbar. We will address as many questions as we can throughout the webinar. Participation in today's webinar is worth 1.5 CCS credits, and your transcripts will be updated within a couple of weeks. Please note that this webinar is not open to the press, and the information provided should not be republished in any way. I am excited to welcome Lisa Gelsomino, President and CEO at Avalon Risk Management and the co-chair of the COAC Trade Enforcement and Revenue Collection Subcommittee. Lisa will introduce our speaker from Customs, as well as help moderate the webinar and provide updates from the COAC AD Working Group, including new ADCVD provisions under the Trade Faciliation and Trade Enforcement Act. We are happy to have her with us today, so without further delay, I will get things started and turn it over to Lisa.
Thank you, and I'm happy to be here. And again, as co-chair of what we call TURC and overseeing the Anti-Dumping Working Group, I'm very happy that Alexander Amdur from CBP has joined us today. We had sent out our bios, but just to give you a brief overview, Alexander is the Director of CBP's Anti-Dumping and Countervailing Duty Policy and Programs Division within the Office of International Trade at CBP. This division is responsible for CBP's national ADCVD enforcement policy, and they serve as CBP's liaison to the Department of Commerce on ADCVD issues and are the subject matter experts within CBP. If some of you joined us in January when I had the Department of Commerce here, they showed their phase of the process. So today, we'd really like to have CBP show, their role in the process as the enforcement agency for DOC. Prior to joining CBP in 2007, Alexander actually worked with the International Trade Administration of the U.S. Department of Commerce. So that's why he's very familiar with the provisions of commerce, what they can do. He's a great asset on our Anti-Dumping Working Group. And he also has a BA in International Relations from Tufts University and a master's in Foreign Service from Georgetown University. So if you were on the webinar in January with Department of Commerce, Wendy Frankel and Elizabeth Erfer also had MBAs. So we're hoping, Alex, it doesn't take an MBA to learn anti-dumping.
No, I don't have an MBA, actually.
But still, some very educated people who are teaching us about anti-dumping, so we welcome them. And just a brief introduction, I wanted to talk about why anti-dumping is a priority trade issue for CBP. It's one of 7, actually. The recent Trade Faciliation and Trade Enforcement Act actually added 2 new trade priorities. Revenue, and obviously anti-dumping countervailing duty, having specific margins that are added on to certain commodities, whether because they're dumped into the U.S. or have certain government provisions, countervailing duty provisions, that are making them less than market price here. So that actually is a loss of revenue to CBP, and that's why it's such a priority. And as a surety, what we see as claims that come under the customs bonds that are guaranteeing the duties, we actually will see what we call increased or supplemental duty bills that come in. But in addition to that, CBP, as the enforcement arm, can also look at civil penalties for fraud or negligence in handling these shipments. They also get involved working with ICE and Homeland Security investigations, as well as Department of Justice, who may prosecute claims, especially criminal situations. And with anti-dumping, I think what's so unique about it is it really does touch on all of these priority trade issues in many ways. If you look at import safety, some of the most high-risk anti-dumping commodities, such as honey, mushrooms, crawfish, shrimp, they actually, also have FDA and USDA issues, and they also could have import safety issues and other liquidated damage claims or seizures that could come from that, bringing that food in. We'll show an example, I think, of garlic later on. Just recently, intellectual property rights usually is more for counterfeit goods, but there was just an anti-dumping case, I think, that for steel that was filed under Section 337. So, even there, anti-dumping is kind of being unique. And there's also textiles, which are subject to anti-dumping duties. And sometimes we also often see certain claims that come in where anti-dumping was subject to the merchandise, but they try to bring it in as duty-free. So they're trying to evade by using duty-free trade agreements, even though dumping should have prevailed. So I think it'll be interesting to hear from Alexander today about these issues and why anti-dumping is one of the most prominent ones that we're looking at today. So I think we're having trouble just moving our screen here, but hopefully it'll come along. Okay. All right. So I did actually include some information here about CBP's year-end numbers in terms of their trade and travel figures, their economic report on trade enforcement. And I would really encourage you today, we'll show you many information and details that are available on the CBP website about enforcement updates. These are all hyperlinks that you'll get in the presentation. And this summarizes really where CBP's enforcement efforts stand. Over 325 ADCVD cases or orders, as we'll show, covering over 140 commodities. That often changes that number. It fluctuates, but that was the year-end figures. And CBP has collected over $1.2 billion in ADCVD cash deposits, and that has actually doubled from the prior year if you're looking at and keeping track of the figures. And as you'll see here, they've been much more aggressive in their audits to help look at discrepancies on the entries. We'll talk a lot about that today and how CBP goes through that process. They have been more aggressive in allocating those penalties, and of course working with ICE, as I mentioned, to seize merchandise. So as you can see here, ADCVD cases are definitely on the rise. There's been the highest number filed in over 14 years. So that is why it's important for us to hear from Alexander today. And so I'm going to turn it over to him with his comments.
Okay, good afternoon and good morning, wherever you are. Thanks really appreciate the great interest in this subject, and also especially thanks to NCPFA and Lisa for all their work to put this together. So let me get right into it. So this is not only a revenue issue for us, for CBP. Of course, the revenue is collecting the revenue that's due to the U.S. government is extremely important. But ADCVD has a dimension that's beyond just the revenue. It's really part of CBP's mission to protect U.S. national economic security. And why is this a national security issue? So this is ADCVD is all about fair competition and leveling the playing field for U.S. manufacturers. So CBP collects the duties on imports that commerce has determined are sold at unfair low prices and subsidized by foreign governments to level it out, level the prices out, and to give U.S. manufacturers a chance for fair competition. And as you know, for our CBP really has a dual trade mission to both facilitate legitimate trade and also to enforce the ADCVD and other trade laws. So as I believe Lisa mentioned, to really understand anti-dumping countervailing duties, you have to begin with the U.S. Department of Commerce. Anti-dumping and countervailing duties are a U.S. Department of Commerce requirement, and the U.S. Department of Commerce is the administering authority for ADCVD in the U.S. government. And what we're going to be basically talking today about compliance and best practices and sources of compliance information. And for ADCVD, you really need to start with the U.S. Department of Commerce, because this is where all of the ADCVD requirements are coming from. So Commerce determines the ADCVD duty rates. They determine what products are subject to anti-dumping and what countries are subject to anti-dumping and countervailing duties. And then when they reach their decisions, then they instruct CBP to collect the ADCVD duties on imports. If you could go to the next slide, there we go. So the particular area within the Department of Commerce that's responsible for administering the ADCVD law is called Enforcement Compliance, part of the International Trade Administration. And they have a great deal of information on their website to help you with your ADCVD compliance. So they have one main website, the trade.gov enforcement, which is a great starting off point. But I would really recommend you can click on their link to their when you go to that website, you can click on the link to their operations directorates, because this is basically the part of the enforcement compliance that is doing all the reviews, all the investigations, and where you'll find the most information on their website to help you with your compliance. You have all the Federal Register notices and all the decision memoranda that Commerce is putting out on all their ADCVD proceedings. They're very transparent proceedings. Also very important, they're doing news releases to get out information, another way to get information on the ADCVD proceedings. And then they also have various links so you can get information on products subject to ADCVD duties. So I've put up a screenshot. I realize didn't come out, it's not as good as if you actually go to those sites, but it gives you a real overview of the information that's available on ADCVD on the Commerce site. And this is specifically the second link to the operations page. So as I mentioned, Commerce determines what the ADCVD duty rates are, the products, the countries, the companies that are subject, and then they instruct CBP to enforce these duties. And basically, CBP has a very unique partnership with Commerce Department, in which basically Commerce basically manages part of CBP's ACE system, which is the system of record for ADCVD information. Commerce sets up all the ADCVD cases in ACE and populates all the ADCVD case information, and then also all the messages that Commerce sends to CBP. All the public messages are available in ACE also. There's two separate areas. There's an ADCVD case management area where you can do searches on for the case management information, and also there's ADCVD message portal where you can do searches on all of the ADCVD messages. And we've also worked with COAC on the ADCVD Working Group to increase the amount of information that was available. In the past years, and some of the feedback that we got was, this is all great, but then we also need, we don't want to be just looking at one case at a time. We need the capability to access all this information that we have the public access to, and so that's why the reports are a great utility, ACE reports for you to use, and specifically this ACE ES-105 active case report, which basically allows ACE users to essentially download all of the public ADCVD case information in one report. It's a huge report, but it's a really helpful tool if that's the way you want to approach it. And again, also to stress that ACE is the system of record for ADCVD information, and so if you do have ACE access, I really recommend, or if you're eligible to get ACE access, I recommend that's where you go to get your ADCVD case information and the ADCVD public messages. Just so note that there's also non-public messages that Commerce sends to CBP, but those are only available to Commerce and CBP only.
And just to add, when I go through my section, I'll actually show a lot of slides that show you how you can access this information. And I do think it's important for the customs brokers on the line, as well as the importers who may be self-filers, to understand these comments that ACE is the system of record. As a surety company, we don't actually get into the ACE or get all of the reports that a customs broker or importer does, which is why we rely on the ADCVD search page, which provides us with a great deal of information. We can get into the ACE portal to get other information, but that's why ACE, where all entries are filed, is that system of record, real time.
Right, and it's also the system of record for the ADCVD case information and messages as well. So it's both ACE's entry processing system, has for ADCVD the case information as well. And it's not only serve an informational purpose. When Commerce sets up the ADCVD cases in ACE, it interacts with our entry processing system and allows ADCVD entries to be filed.
Correct.
And so That's your first stop is ACE. We also have a lot of other compliance information on our other websites as well. On cbp.gov, we have an ADCVD page, which I really recommend that you get to know. There's a few things I want to point out here. One is we have a link to ADCVD frequently asked questions. We understand that there's some issues that come up over and over for you, and then we often hear from all of you with these same questions. And so in order to assist you, we put together this document, which is linked to this page. So it's a resource for you for how you can get information, how you can get answers to your questions. So again, there's a link on ADCVD frequently asked questions. So before you reach out to CBP or the Commerce Department, I really recommend that you look at this ADCVD frequently asked questions. This contains a lot of links to other information and guidance on where to go look for information. And so we really recommend you try to find this information on your own. And that's why we set this up. There's also a lot of other information on this website. Another link I want to point out to is ADCVD Enforcement Updates. We've been trying to respond to a lot of interest in what CBP is doing for ADCVD enforcement. We're trying to make it a lot more transparent. And so we post monthly updates under this ADCVD Enforcement Updates link on our enforcement work. And then there's also a lot of links to some other agency press releases on what they're doing for ADCVD enforcement as well.
And you'll see from the slides that I've done today as well, a lot of snippets from these enforcement updates showing you how you can get that information and how you can update your CSM messaging to make sure you're receiving this information. So this is really good stuff that you've put out here on the website for us.
Thanks. And then also want to point out, which I'll refer back to later, we have a link to ADCVD scam alerts. But I'll refer to that later. Just want to point that out. And so then also we have from our ADCVD page and from our other pages, cbp.gov, you can get to our ADCVD search system. We set this up primarily for companies and individuals who do not have ACE access, but still need access to all of the ADCVD, the public ADCVD messages. So this is an unofficial system where we have basically copies of all of the public ADCVD messages that are available in ACE. So if you do not have access to ACE, this is another resource you can use to get ADCVD message information. And I just wanted to point out, I don't know how well you can see it, there's a What's New section. We have the top banner, then under the top banner you have a What's New section, and then you have a link that says View Most Recent Messages. So you can actually basically go into ACE every day and search for that day and the past day's messages. And then you can also go into ADCVD Search and click to view the most recent messages, and it'll show you in chronological order, the most recent messages that are in the ADCVD Search System. And things change very quickly for ADCVD duties, and other ADCVD requirements. So this is a really excellent functionality, both in ACE and ADCVD Search. So every day you can get updates on the instructions that Commerce has sent to CBP on ADCVD. So there's also a lot of other compliance information. Before I get into these other agencies, I want to note some other sources of CBP compliance information, and this is not meant to be a comprehensive list of all of the compliance information out there for you, just as a note, but I just wanted to note some others. One, we have our cargo systems messaging service, the CSMS system you can sign up for, and so you can get updates sent to you. We have the customs ruling system, CROSS. There's a lot of rulings out there on on ADCVD issues. And so if you have a question, this is also a great resource for you to check how CBP has ruled on this issue potentially in the past, if we have ruled on this issue. We also have a section on our website on informed compliance publications on a wide variety of issues, which is again out there to help you with your informed compliance. We have the ACE Entry Summary Business Rules for the trade, which is scanning on cbp.gov, which has a section on ADCVD. And if you really want to get into the technical requirements, we also have the CATSAIR documents to help you with really the technical side of filing ADCVD entries. And then as part of your ADCVD compliance, there's other information on other agency websites as well. First of all, I wanted to mention the U.S. International Trade Commission. So for the initial ADCVD investigations and for the sunset reviews that are every 5 years, I believe, so there's actually two agencies that need to make a ruling on the ADCVD, which is both Commerce Department and the U.S. International Trade Commission. So the U.S. International Trade Commission makes the injury determinations, and they have a great deal of information on all of the ADCVD cases as well, and all of the ADCVD orders. Also, U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement. CBP works, of course, very closely with our sister agency on ADCVD enforcement, and they have a great deal of information on past cases and convictions that ICE have worked on for ADCVD violations. And then also the U.S. Department of Justice. That's not really oftenly talked about in terms of ADCVD. You think about CBP, you think about Commerce, think about ICE, ITC, but the Department of Justice has an incredibly critical role in ADCVD enforcement. They're the prosecutors in the court that prosecute the criminal violations. They're also, I believe it's correct terminology, they're prosecuting an increasing number of False Claims Act cases involving ADCVD. So they have a great deal of information and play a really vital role in ADCVD enforcement, ADCVD compliance. And so there's a lot of information on their website as well.
And earlier in the presentation, I actually provided you with the link to the False Claim Act. If you haven't seen that, there are a lot of ADCVD cases that do fall under that. And under CBP's website, they frequently post the outcome of that litigation. And I'll show you how to navigate through some of these websites later on in the presentation. And also would like to just add that we recognize that there's many different sites when it involves anti-dumping. Not any different than when you deal with a commodity that is subject to different PGAs. You do have to navigate to different websites. But I do want to say that CBP has been trying to facilitate through their web page links to some of these other sites, but each agency will obviously have to manage their own site. And so you can either get to some of them through the CBP website, or you can access them directly.
And so then also we have functionalities on the CBP website. We have something called an RSS feed, so you can sign up for it. So it'll send you out updates on new items that are posted on individual pages. And you can also use different search engines to set up, so other search engines outside of cbp.gov you can use to set up updates for yourself for key terms. So there's a lot of ways you can keep updated. But again, for them, a lot of the key information is in the messages, and so I really recommend on a regular basis checking the messages and the new ADCVD requirements. Okay, so now I just want to spend a few minutes on talk about some best practices, like based on our experience, some of the areas that you need to watch out for in your ADCVD compliance. So first of all, the written scope of the order is dispositive. I know for customs brokers, one of your important duties is HTS classification, but when you're dealing with anti-dumping, you have to realize this is not HTS classification. This is really scope classification. While HTS numbers are provided for guidance purposes, they're not dispositive. The written scope of the order is dispositive. you basically need to classify goods that are subject to ADCVD based on the written scope of the order. And I know that's kind of, I know we get into a lot of practices. We're thinking HTS, 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 but then when it comes to ADCVD orders, you have to do a stop, get into a new mindset, and you have to think about scope classification, not HTS class, in addition to the HTS classification for, again, for the normal entry requirements. And so also, it's also important to remember that there's a CBP country of origin, which is reported on the entry and the entry summary. The country of origin for ADCVD purposes may differ, and you need to follow the written scope of the order to determine whether something is subject to ADCVD, even though it might have a completely different CBP country of origin. You know, a great example of this is solar cells and solar panels. So solar cells from China are subject to ADCVD, including solar cells that are in solar panels. And so often what happens is that Chinese solar cells are sold all around the world, and they're put into panels, manufactured into panels in a third country. Now, the CBP country of origin for a panel is usually the place where the panel is manufactured. So if you have a panel that's manufactured with Chinese solar cells in Mexico, the CBP country of origin is usually Mexico, but it's still subject, as Chinese solar cells, it is still subject to the Chinese ADCVD order, because the written scope of the order covers Chinese solar cells in solar panels. So again, in many different ways, the written scope of the order is dispositive. And then finally, there are often anti-dumping and countervailing duty requirements on the same merchandise from the same country. There are completely separate proceedings with completely separate case numbers and completely separate duty rates. But you need to be very careful, because we often see that entries are filed with the anti-dumping but not the required countervailing duty, or the required countervailing duty but not the required anti-dumping. So when you're doing your basically your scope classification, and then you find one case that is subject to an anti-dumping case, you need to check if there's also a countervailing duty case that's also applicable based on the scope of the countervailing duty case and the anti-dumping case. So again, you need to be really careful about this. It's very complex. The second point I want to get into is that Commerce instructs CBP that estimated ADCVD duties are due on imports entered or withdrawn from warehouse for consumption on or after the effective date. So if you don't want to pay, if your importer does not want to pay ADCVD duties on a good, don't enter it for consumption, and don't withdraw it from the warehouse for consumption. So we got a lot of complaints to saying, well, you know, actually I didn't mean to import it. You know, I was just going to land it in Houston. I was going to send it on to Mexico, but I made a mistake, and I entered it in Houston as a consumption entry. Now, there's no duty drawback on ADCVD, and so all of the ADCVD is due. Especially when you're dealing with there's a lot of trade that goes back and forth between Mexico and Canada. You need to be very careful how you enter those goods. But it's also not only restricted to that. That if you don't want to pay the ADCVD duties, you should not enter it for consumption. Or I should put it this way, rather correct myself, you do not need to pay the ADCVD duties and don't want to pay them, you should not enter them for consumption. Now, if you don't mind, you can go ahead and enter them for consumption, but just realize that the ADCVD duties will be due and there's no duty drawback on ADCVD. So if
If they try to, destruct them or export them, is that anything?
No, there's no duty drawback.
Yeah, so
on ADCVD.
And we get this question a lot as the surety too, because a lot of times they were not aware duties applied, but once the goods are here, we're in the same predicament because we've already provided the bond that guarantees those duties that are due. And it puts customs brokers in E&O situations for the same reason, because the importer may be holding them responsible for not knowing or not advising about anti-dumping. And so I think somebody who mentioned here on the webinar that it is very important to realize that customs brokers do not determine the scope, and it really is up to the importer to know how their product, be informed and how their product applies to anti-dumping. Right.
And so, if it is, just to clarify, that if it is a legal consumption entry, it should be filed as a legal consumption entry. But if it qualifies for another type of cargo movement and it's not going to be consumed in the U.S., then you should consider doing it so if for being take into account the ADCVD liability. Okay, so the next one, keep up to date on which exporters, manufacturers applicable to each case number and cash deposit rates. So let me explain this. So for regular HTS duty rates, they can only change with an act of Congress. For the ADCVD duty rates can change when Commerce establishes them through their ADCVD proceedings, and usually, in most cases, a Federal Register notice. And so ADCVD rates change on a regular basis, and sometimes even annually, if not more often. So you really need to keep close attention to all the ADCVD messages and the ADCVD case information because the ADCVD duty rates do change on a regular basis. And this is very different from the regular HTS duty rates, which don't change that often because it takes an act of Congress to change them. And also, basically, for each ADCVD duty rate is linked to a specific company-specific ADCVD case number. And so you also need to keep up with the ADCVD case numbers and which foreign manufacturers and exporters are eligible to use those case numbers, because those requirements for those case numbers also change on a regular basis as well. For example, like in 1 year, you may have to have both a foreign manufacturer and exporter to be eligible to use a certain case number and duty rates, and then the next year it may change to an exporter-only rate. Or it could possibly change that 1 year you have an exporter is eligible to use a specific ADCVD cash deposit rate, but then the next year they lose that specific rate and they fall under the countrywide or all others rates. And these change again on a regular basis, and you need to keep up with them.
And I will later on in the presentation show you an example of this. I know from the last webinar that was the feedback. You wanted to see a case from beginning to end, so we'll be able to demonstrate how that can change to you.
And so this really leads into the next point, which is like pay close attention to supply chains. Supply chains can be, international supply chains can be extremely complex. There's a lot of different commercial reasons why supply chains are set up in different ways. And they don't always take into account what the ADCVD requirements are going to be. And unfortunately, because of sometimes how international supply chains are set up, for some commercial reasons, as a result, a higher duty rate may apply because of for example, who the exporter is exporting from the foreign country. They really need to pay close attention to supply chains and how that interacts with the foreign exporter manufacturer requirements for the ADCVD duty rates. And also, you need to do your due diligence on your suppliers and customers. We've had a lot of unfortunate circumstances in which importers have came to us and said, our supplier, our foreign supplier, told us this wasn't subject to ADCVD, but then when we received it and customs tested it, we found out it was subject to ADCVD. You got to be really careful because the importer that's responsible for the ADCVD duties. It's your responsibility, not the foreign exporter. So you have to be very careful what they're actually what they're actually sending you, and do your due diligence. So making sure that you're working with a trustworthy supplier. And also for your customers as well. I know most of you are probably customs brokers. You have importers as customers. You make sure you do your due diligence on your customers as well, so you know what they're up to, what they're importing, what their business practices are, so you don't get associated with a potential like violative situation, violative enforcement situation. And also be prepared to document your entry data. And this is even more important than ever as we go to, as we're going to be soon transitioning to all Type 3 entries in ACE, which of course are electronic entries. But CBP has the right and authority to request the documents for any ACE entry at any time. And especially in order to document the many issues associated with ADCVD, the scope issues, the manufacturer, the exporter, the country manufacturer, can be quite complicated. And so you should be prepared to document all of that data to support your assertions. But not only for the Type 3 entries, but also for your Type 1 entries as well, if you're importing a merchandise that you know that has ADCVD implications as well. That even if you don't think it's subject to ADCVD, make sure if there's ADCVD on that merchandise from another country, make sure in case CBP checks that you have documents to substantiate whether it's not subject to ADCVD. And then we also have, we realize that there's honest mistakes that are made and that a lot of you are doing regular checks to make sure that you're reporting the correct information. And so we do have many different ways for you to come forward and to report the correct information, post-entry amendments, post-summary corrections, prior disclosures, among them. And we really recommend that you take advantage of them to report the correct information. And then when you're doing your ADCVD compliance, watch out for ADCVD scams. So I mentioned that before. On our website, we have a link to an ADCVD scam warning that basically there's a lot of companies all over the world that are mass emailing and putting up on websites, basically enticing you to commit crimes. They're basically enticing you to transship, legally transship goods subject to ADCVD, and to use other methods, basically other illegal methods to get around ADCVD duties. They'll tell you, don't worry, we'll take care of it, no ADCVD. Yeah, but they're not the ones that ICE will, or the Department of Justice will send to jail, or the ones that CBP will come knocking with these huge duty bills. And it's essentially these things. There's, I'm sure most of you have seen them. There's these widespread emails and websites. And so that's why we put up this ADCVD scam notice on our website as a warning that this is illegal. And so you have to watch out for that. And when in the course of your compliance work, when you come across these scams, when you come across these illegitimate activity, unfortunately, it's out there. We know it's out there. We need your help to level the playing field. And it's not only level the playing field for the U.S. domestic manufacturers, we also want to make sure there's fair competition among importers and people in the importing community as well. And so our ADCVD enforcement is a partnership with the trade. You're out there in the business world, you know what's going on, and you often see a lot of a lot of non-compliant things that are going on. And there's a way for you to confidentially report that in confidence and to CBP using our e-allegation system, and we really recommend and really appreciate when we get that information. It really helps. Really helps to make level playing field and fair rules of the game for everybody. And so then finally, I want to talk about some of the types of ADCVD evasion that we're seeing and that you may see. One, I mentioned the legal transshipment. There's also undervaluation. There's misclassification, both incorrect HTS misclassification, intentional, to try to get it out of our viewpoint, as well as they're intentionally using the wrong ADCVD cases as well to try to pay a lower ADCVD duty. There's outright smuggling, where they're smuggling in goods without reporting them. And then we go into all types of different issues. There's product engineering. There's issues when it comes to valuation between related parties, some very, very complex issues. So, I mean, you can call them scams, you can call them evasion, you can call them non-compliance. We know it's out there. You can see by the ICE and the DOJ website, the CBP website, we have all the press releases for all the people that get caught and all the penalties that they face. So that's what we're, really the point of this webinar is try to avoid getting to that point, to give you some of the best practices for compliance and to give you some of the areas of information we can use for your compliance.
And later on in the presentation, I'm going to give you some real examples of where this evasion has happened. I think the more you can hear the real stories, the easier it is for you to, detect it. So here's Alexander's contact information again. We're going to take a break here before I get into my section to take a couple questions that have come in, some of which are going to be answered later on in the presentation, so we'll get to them then. But the first one that we received, is there a method to get an opinion on whether an item might be subject to AD or CVD duties other than a formal proposal that, from what I have read and have been told, could take months and cost thousands of dollars in legal fees?
Okay. So what this is referring to, to get a binding HTS classification ruling, you can get that from CBP. But since ADCVD is a Commerce Department requirement, to get a binding ADCVD scope ruling, you have to go to the Commerce Department. So you can also ask, an import specialist at a center of excellence and expertise in the industry that you're working with to get their advice on the subject to ADCVD or not. But in order to get a binding ruling, you have to go to the Commerce Department. ADCVD is a Commerce Department requirement, and they're the only agency that has authority to give binding scope rulings.
And the binding scope ruling, not to be confused with the binding ruling on classification.
Correct.
For HTS. So we're going to talk about some of the questions you submitted later on, but there's another question that came in. If an article is subject to both ADD and CVD, is it possible that the written scope of the ADD order differs from the CVD order?
I guess technically everything is possible because sometimes they file the AD and CVD petitions simultaneously, and so they have the same scope, but sometimes they do the anti-dumping at one time and the CVD at a later time, so it's possible that the scopes could be different. I think usually that you see that they're very similar or alike, but they could be different.
I guess this ties into it. With the exception of shipper-exporter rate lists, is it possible for the written scope of an order to change over time, i.e., should the concerned party make sure they are reading the most current written scope?
This is kind of a technical question. This is really best addressed by Commerce. Let me try to address this. I believe Commerce does scope rulings, so the scope I don't think changes, but they do provide scope rulings which helps clarify the scope.
And that was correct in the last webinar we did in January, because as they issue their initial scope ruling, there are other shippers who come in to see whether they're subject to that scope ruling. So I think the example that Wendy Frankel from Department of Commerce gave is, a lug nut, right? A lug nut is a lug nut is a lug nut, and if you have a lug nut, you're kind of subject to the scope ruling. Now contrast that with a case like aluminum extrusions, which had a lot of clarity on the scope and a lot of people challenging the scope, and that particular commodity spans 120 different HTS codes, right? So it is going to vary, and I do think each kind of scope ruling that comes down from Commerce could give further clarification, right? So you do have to kind of read the one that's relevant for your particular product, but that doesn't mean that another product may not be subject to the scope at a later point in time, right? Is the best way, I guess, we explained it in the last kind of webinar as well. There was a question that came in, what is the best way to file an 03 entry when an item is determined to be within the scope description of an ADCVD order, but the HTS number is not included in the order? For example, for HTS purpose, the item is a part of another item not covered by HTS guidance numbers included in an order, but for ADCVD purposes, the item is considered an aluminum extrusion.
So we basically have, edits to promote proper HTS classification. So that the HTS number that you're filing with has to be in the ACE case management system with that case. So each case, each ADCVD case number has some HTS numbers linked to it. And so in order to file a type 3 entry with that case number, you need to use one of those HTS numbers. But currently at least. But if the HTS number is not there and you're getting a rejection, you can't file it, you need to contact an import specialist, and then they will work with us and the National Import Specialist to contact the Commerce Department to add that HTS. We are looking at functionality, so to make it easier to file ADCVD entries, so that HTS does not need to be specifically recorded in ACE for that case number, but that's something that we are currently looking at.
Okay, and so another question came in about bringing the goods in. Let me find it. You indicated ADCVD duties are due when imports are entered for consumption. What about products imported into a foreign trade zone?
So products typically, so for FTZ, that's a good question. That the ADCVD is not usually due until it's withdrawn from the foreign trade zone for consumption. But you need to be very careful if you're exporting from an FTZ to Canada or Mexico, because there's some very complicated NAFTA duty deferral rules that potentially apply. That there actually may be ADCVD liability due to those NAFTA duty deferral rules, which are beyond the scope of this presentation.
Right.
But generally, when the goods are withdrawn from consumption from an FTZ, is when the duties are due, and you can actually use a case number on the, I believe it's the type 06 FTZ entry.
Okay, great. We're going to go on with the presentation and then take more questions afterwards. Just a few updates from our Turk subcommittee. As Alexander had mentioned, e-allegations, we recently put forth a recommendation that CBP tried to advertise this more. It has become actually quite an effective tool. I guess recently read an article that about 90% of e-allegations are IPR violations and about 10 are anti-dumping. And as you can see, this is where you can get more information. You can remain anonymous, and there is kind of a whistleblower, I guess, compensation feature to it. Many people do think that it's one competitor making claims against another, but it is something that CBP uses as a very useful tool to investigate allegations that come in. And as you can see from these screenshots, I know they're hard to see, but you can report both criminal and trade violations. I believe the criminal, do those go directly to ICE?
I believe so.
And then the trade violations come to CBP. And this is showing you how when you first report it, it is not a required field like some of the others, so you can remain anonymous. The other things that you may have heard under the Trade Facilitation and Trade Enforcement Act is the new ADCVD Enforce and Protect provisions, specifically the Trade Remedy Law Enforcement Division that was created. I give you a link to the article where CBP announced this task force. And if you read the Act, you'll see under Section 517 how there are procedures for handling this. And I think that CBP is in the process now of putting together some operating procedures, very similar to e-allegations where something will come in. But the difference is that allegations submitted under this new provision must be reviewed in 15 days, and there must be transparency to the submitter to the extent that they disclose themselves. So obviously, Customs is looking at this right now. We get a lot of questions about it. CBP announced that there would be an interim final rule issued sometime in August, and I do know through the COAC Anti-Dumping Working Group, these are some of the things that we'll be discussing to give feedback to CBP if and when the time is coming to put out the rule, and also there will be a comment period to this. So this is just an update for your reference. I don't know, Alex, if you have anything to add to that. Probably not. So as far as some of the COAC recommendations Alex had touched on earlier, yes, he mentioned how they have improved their CSM messaging, and you probably have seen this come out with new investigations. This is a great enhancement where now when there's a new investigation, they send that out, and they also
Commerce Department,
from the Commerce Department investigation, and then you also send, I think, links to the different documents from the Department of Commerce, right, to that message?
I don't remember the content of the actual messages.
But this gives you links to some of those new cases, and this was directly a result of a COAC recommendation. Alex had also mentioned how you could go into the CSM messaging fields and update your subscriptions. You need to make sure that you're updated for anti-dumping and countervailing duties under the trade section to be getting some of the updates, and also the RSS feeds of updates made to the website. And because valued customs brokers, they need to know everything as they interface with ABI, you'll find that if you also sign up for ABI updates, you'll be receiving almost everything you need to know about anti-dumping, among other things. And you can also sign up for similar updates, as Alex had mentioned earlier, under the ITC. So this just gives you the links and where you can go. We had a couple questions. Yes, everybody will get a PDF copy of this presentation, and these live links will take you where you need to go to update that information if you desire. The other thing that we are looking at is when it comes to the customs bonds, every shipment that enters the commerce of the U.S. must be bonded to, guarantee and protect the revenue, as well ensure compliance. And so one section of HR 644 has this verbiage about an importer risk assessment. So this is also something that we're looking at under the COAC working groups because of the priority trade issues, and anti-dumping being one of them. So this is where I wanted to get into a real case study to kind of show you how this can kind of come to fruition. I got this feedback from the webinar last time. Also, Ted Sherman from Target, who's on our anti-dumping working group, suggested this is how to best understand it. So what I'm taking is the wooden bedroom furniture case from China. If you go into the ADCVD search page that we mentioned earlier, you'll find that there's over 291 different records and messaging about it. It's been a very active case. It has a lot of challenges to scope rulings. This is a situation where through injunctions and the Court of International Trade, sometimes they're taking on those scope rulings. With commerce, this is why cases can often go on for years and have delays. This shows you different things about revocations, partial revocations, what they mean, new shipper reviews, as well as the administrative reviews that take place every year. So let's just start with the process. So I'm taking the chart from the webinar in January that Department of Commerce provided and kind of overlaying how did this case first start, wooden bedroom furniture. As you can see here, day 0, a petition was filed with Commerce, and they have to initiate investigation within 20 days. And then the ITC has to look at injury, as you mentioned earlier, and make their preliminary determination. So what will happen is that when the preliminary determination comes out, in this case it came out June 24th, 2004, this is the time where as brokers, entries must be flagged as 03. Back then, there used to be an option for bonding for the margin, but now actually because of fraud and many things, only cash deposits are accepted. And then the underlying continuous bond still governs that. We'll talk about that later. But when this preliminary margin first came out, you'll see that the rates varied from one shipper or exporter of record that had 4.92%, another had 10.92%, whereas the all other rate was as high as 198.8%, 08%. So this is the time where cash deposits are posted. And then we have to wait for the final determination from the DOC, which came out in November. And then we still have to wait for the final injury from the ITC. And then, of course, that is when the order comes. So many of you are used to then, you get that ADCVD order. In this case, it was issued January 4th, 2005. And so this is where Customs would then look back from the preliminary, when the investigation started, right, to look at what the rates were. And so a lot of people think, oh, well, this is now final. You know, now that this order comes out, I'm posting these cash deposits, but it's actually quite the reverse. The margins that I cite here, the 492, the 1092, the 198, those are capped during that stage. But now that the case has gone to order, that's when the margin can change, right?
Yes,
and
that's why that arrow is red. That means warning.
Warning.
Because
yes.
The cash deposits are just that. They're deposits. The final duties, so basically after the order comes out, if I may, Commerce yes. enters into a cycle where there's opportunities every year to do a retrospective review of the past year's entries to determine what the final duties could be. So the final duty could go increase from the cash deposit, it could go down from the cash deposit, or it could stay the same. And for the increase, there's no limit after the order on how much it can increase. And so when you're working, if you're a small importer or working with small importers or importers that aren't very, don't have a lot of complex importing resources, you really need to advise them of this risk they're taking on, which is basically unlimited final liability for these goods, which may not be known for years.
Right, and that's where we kind of take this case on next. But these dates, as I mentioned, were provided by Commerce, and so there's a lot of charts always flying out there, so that's why I know these dates are accurate, but they reference how they may be extended because of certain circumstances. As you can see here, was over 384 days for this case. Of course, if there's negative determinations anywhere in the process, the case would end, and that's where I guess you get into something being, would
right.
it be revoked or
sure.
terminated at
but
that time?
To put this into perspective, for every case, every ADCVD case, like wood and better furniture, that only has one investigation once to determine whether there should be an anti-dumping countervailing duty order, and then it enters into the cycles of annual reviews, which keep going on and on until the order is finally revoked. So most of the messages that you'll see from Commerce are the cash deposits and liquidation messages that result from the annual administrative reviews to determine the final duty liability.
Which we have examples of this. So then when you're going into ACE as a system of record, or where I would go as a surety into the ADCVD search page, you could pull up all of these instructions that are giving you guidance. As you see here, I'm looking at liquidation, I'm pulling up this case number that's specifically wooden bedroom furniture, and I'm looking at, if I open one of these documents, I could see from the administrative review, the period of review is 2011. So thinking where we started this now to 2011. And I'm looking specifically at this exporter that I've highlighted with this error. I guess Baju, I don't even know how you say the name. But you could see here they were originally at a 41.75% rate in 2011. And if we look at the next slide, in the administrative review process, let's say now this is real time. As of April 11th, 2016, there was an administrative review conducted for wooden bedroom furniture, And that exporter of record Bajou that I noted from the prior slide from 2011 is now getting the period of review of 2014. So what happens? They have been paying all along a cash deposit of 41.75% with a final liquidation rate that is not known. When it comes out on April 11, 2016, that period of review for 2014 retrospectively, that 41.75% rate increased to the all others rate of 216.04%. Noting that the all others rate used to be 198.04, that's also increased at this point in time.
So if we could stay there for a minute,
yes,
also
sure.
with the period of review, that is the period of entry. So what this is saying is that basically all entries through January through December 2014, as of April 2016, are now subject to a 216% final duty rate, an increase of about 175 percentage points. And so again, so these goods are imported as early as January 2014, imported a long time ago. Now at this point, this is the final bill. It's going to be issued by CBP, assuming that there's no litigation in the Court of International Trade preventing the liquidation instructions and billing going forward.
Yes, and so where are they now? They actually have to start paying that rate going forward, but there's still a gap in time where they have to go through the next administrative review and another period of review for 2015, as well as, you know, most of 2016 before they figure out what that final rate is, right? So there's still a lot of uncertainty to go, and you'll see in some of the examples later how something like this could really put an importer out of business if they didn't know what they were getting themselves into. And also another reason why there's shell companies who just kind of set themselves up to circumvent this, knowing that the rates are like this and knowing that they vary.
Yeah, there's basically there's often that are shell companies that are set up to import goods subject to ADCVD. They pay the cash deposits, but clearly they have no intention to be around to pay the final duties. And so there's basically shells for future ADCVD debt, corporate shells for ADCVD debt.
Exactly, which is where it brings us to the new shipper reviews, because during the administrative review process, if you're a shipper that doesn't have a designated rate, you want to apply for a better rate. But the truth is, many times they have no intention of doing so. They set up a fraudulent company, and this is an example under a bond that we wrote. As you can see, CBP liquidated the entries at the final margin of 367%. They were originally coming in at a 0% rate. This is garlic that actually had some 0% rates that were being used at the time. A value of $324,000 per entry. It resulted in $3.24 million in duties that were due, probably plus interest. And this was all done against a $50,000 continuous bond. So yes, oftentimes that importer's long gone. CBP is out, you know, a great deal of money, because I think we were on the bond for multiple periods, and you were out $2.8 million. And this is why bonding for new shipper reviews is no longer really allowed. They have to really provide cash deposits for the margin at that time. Isn't that something that HR 644 recently changed again?
Yes, that's only basically in the past, during the time that Commerce was conducting the new shipper proceeding. By law, the importers were able to bond for the cash deposits. But that, I understand, that's been terminated by the new law. So now but that was only during the period of the new shipper review. But now that they're able, that was not after the new shipper review when they got the new shipper rates. They never were allowed to bond for the cash deposits.
Right. So we get a lot of questions about bonding, so I did include just a quick section on this about Customs Bond 101. It's basically the bond principal, the importer, that importer bringing in goods subject to anti-dumping or anything else. They may get their bond through a broker who comes to a surety agent like Avalon or any other surety that's on the Treasury list, and they guarantee that that bond guarantees Customs as the obligee. And what we're really looking at is the Activity Code 1 under 19 CFR 62 are the provisions that what the bond guarantees. And a customs bond is very much like a bank loan. because the importer is basically applying for a bond that's going to allow their cargo to move immediate release. It's going to allow them to not pay any duties, taxes, and fees sometimes at entry, except for dumping. They'd have to post the deposit. But then that deposit can change, so the bond is guaranteeing any potential change. And sometimes the ability to pay can be even longer. Now, the way Customs defines formulas is currently under review, but you can look at their current formula at this link. So when it comes to dumping, this is where we as a surety and other sureties kind of view it, because bonding isn't required until pre-order and that first preliminary notice that the DOC issues, right? Because the investigation's new. It's when they first set the margins, DOC at that preliminary stage, that they ask for deposits. You used to be able to provide bonds. You'll see that in some of the old notices, but now it's really cash. And as I mentioned, the margin is capped during that stage. And so then there's the post order after the order gets issued, and that's when those margins can change. So final is not so final, and I think that's where sometimes the trade gets confused. But the whole time we may be, a surety may be issuing a continuous bond that's underlying, protecting this all here. And now there's also critical circumstances where Customs can request, or I should say Commerce requests critical circumstances that could go 90 days retroactively. And so there's also, CBP has a policy on its website where they can request a single transaction bond at any time, really, during this process if they feel that the revenue is in jeopardy in some way and the continuous bond is not sufficient. Their policy for doing so is at this link. And they've recently highlighted some situations where they've done that, on garlic in particular. Did you want to mention it all, Alex? I kind of just took a snippet from your last trade enforcement update. What happened there?
Well, there's a lot of different circumstances. This is, well, basically it's an existing authority CBP has to request an additional single transaction bond when CBP believes that the revenue is in jeopardy. So a lot of our work on using single transaction bonds to protect the revenue for garlic have come out publicly because the garlic importers have been taking us to court and for the most part losing. And we've been requesting single transaction bonds because there's unfortunately a lot of illegitimate activity that takes place with ADCVD garlic imports. Not all importers, but many of them. And so there's been a lot of concerns about revenue being put in jeopardy. In which we have been requesting the single transaction bonds for garlic with a lot of success.
Yes, and so also I mentioned the False Claims Act, and this you could see is a situation of wooden bedroom furniture where a Texas importer had to pay $15 million under the False Claims Act. So I also include how you can go into the portal and often through this portal search for what the bond and cash deposit requirements are. And we as a surety use this quite often to see what information is being looked for at each stage of the investigation. Alex had also mentioned how you could go into the ITC's website and pull all of the information that Commerce posts about investigations. They are very transparent. You can also, through this site, get a list of all the anti-dumping orders. I know many of you use this frequently, and this is something you can sort this report and then download it. And just some of you have asked questions. How do you know what's high risk? How do you know what to target? Well, part of it is looking at the orders by commodity and also by country where there might be some higher risk areas. Obviously, steel, a large chunk here. You can see China represents over 40% of the country subject to anti-dumping. And then looking at just the case studies and the enforcement updates that Customs has provided. As you know, the steel industry represents 56% of all orders. I think CBP has been doing tremendous outreach with the steel industry now with the 10 centers of excellence. The Chicago Center is kind of the center for all of those cases and would be handling all those steel cases. One of the recommendations we made at the COAC level was for the centers to kind of come out and show all the anti-dumping cases that they're dealing with. Customs had recently announced on steel shipments how they may go to live entries. I mentioned earlier how the bond allows for immediate release of cargo. Well, If customs renders a live entry, that means that the shipment cannot proceed to immediate delivery. It kind of puts things to a halt, and it does allow customs to do more of a review. So they have the right to do that at any time. There's also, like I said earlier, some of the higher risk cases like aluminum extrusions. I would highly recommend you go to the webinar that Customs had did, I think a couple years ago, about it to learn more about that case. You can look at CBP audits that they're doing under those enforcement updates, and they'll highlight the different commodities that they've been looking at through all their different audits, so you're knowing maybe what are some of the higher risk commodities. You can look at the all others rates because many times when there's a high all others rate, like I showed you for wooden bedroom furniture or for aluminum extrusions for CVD, I think it was over 300%, you'll be able to see the volatility. And I think Alex mentioned earlier how there's some informed compliance updates, like mushrooms has its own informed compliance update that gives you more detail about that commodity. And again, look at some of the trade enforcement and enforcement updates that CBP puts out there. This was, again, a solar panel case you talked about earlier, and this is an example. CBP recently did a whole industry perspective. This has become a very kind of high-risk case that we've been looking at. And you really have to look at all the different cases that are out there because of the components of the solar cell, like you mentioned. And I'm just to share with you a situation that we had where we had a U.S. importer of record bringing in about 1 million in solar panels from China. They were using a shipper rate of 13.8% and provided the cash deposit. What happened is the period CVD rate for the period of entry that they were looking at was deactivated, which really means that they've lost the status of that rate, and they now are going to default to the all other rate of 238%. So this importer is looking at the potential of, you know, over $2.2 million in duties against a $50,000 continuous bond. So what happened next is that they ended up changing their supplier, probably knowing that this supplier lost its rate. They started bringing in goods from Korea. CBP at the same time, noticing this trend, came out and asked for a bond sufficiency review for the bond to be increased to $300,000. They were not meeting their underwriting requirements, had no bond, and then subsequently were trying to bring in $1 million shipment of solar panels from Korea, declaring it duty-free. So these are kind of, I guess, would say the trends that CBP is looking at when people are maybe it's legit, but maybe it's not. Are they, transshipping the cargo? And actually, just a quick review of this this importer, a Google search, as well as a Google search on the supplier that they were using on the documents, showed the company history, and clearly the supplier in Korea had ties to China, and so it really seemed like it could be suspect. So these are some of the trends you might see when you're looking for different things. So some of the questions you've submitted is, how do I get scope review? Where can I go? In the last webinar, we spent the whole 90 minutes on that topic with the Department of Commerce. And this is from their presentation, the information. You have to keep in mind that the DOC is handling all these stages of the investigation, CBP just enforcing it. So we had provided the CLU, which is the Customs Liaison Unit, their call center number. And that is really where people should be going if they have questions on scope. Wouldn't you say, Alex? I know you get a lot of them from CBP, but when it comes to scope, it's really Department of Commerce who is governing that.
That's,
I know.
As I again mentioned before, you can ask import specialists for really a non-binding opinion, but if you really want a, you can call up the call center. I'm not sure what they say. They may advise you to get a scope ruling.
So where is the best place is really at this website that Alex had provided earlier. This shows you Commerce had done the screenshots of exactly where you could find scope rulings and the links to them. You could see here these detailed instructions that'll show you. And they're basically storing these scope rulings since 1999. So when you get a copy of this presentation, you'll have these screenshots that go step by step to guide you through that process. You can also look, though, on the ADCVD search page. A couple questions were, can we find scope rulings on search? I mean, you do actually allow them to.
There's not scope rulings, but there's scope instructions that Commerce sends on scope rulings.
Right, and how CBP is enforcing them. So then you'd have to go back to the Commerce website to actually pull the full scope ruling. Somebody had asked for what these definitions in the search database mean, and those are here, Appendix A. You can see the different message types that you can sort by. I would always recommend searching by case number as opposed to commodity, because sometimes with different scope rulings, different commodity names are used. And then some confusion is revoked versus terminated cases. When we did some of the outreach with the customs brokers from our working group, you have to be very careful on what the differences are, because terminated means that the domestic party is no longer interested in pursuing the case. Revocation is what happens after an ADC order goes through many years of those sunset reviews, and perhaps at that time the DOC may decide to revoke the order. They don't always. Wooden bedroom furniture, a perfect example. Here we are how many years later, and it's still an active case. And then be careful of partial revocation, because this is where one company may have been removed from the order. This is old legislation that has been rescinded, and it's careful to note that sometimes partial revocation doesn't mean that that shipper isn't part of the main case and the all others rate. It could mean that they just lost their individual rate. Where inactive company deactivated, this is another important one, because again, this is an important distinction, because once a specific company has lost their rate, they are then subject to that all others country rate. And again, it's based on the producer, manufacturer, exporter, not necessarily the importer. So if they haven't done the supply chain, hasn't done their due diligence in following the process, it's where the importer could get in a lot of trouble. So this is kind of my last kind of case study for you, which was tires from China, which was handled again under a $50,000 bond. You can see how this importer shifted around. This was an importer that was kind of moving broker to broker, surety to surety. How are we trying to stop this? That was some of the questions. I do know that the Office of Administration at CBP has established their ADCVD collections team that does try to stop this from happening, linking shell companies to one another. As you know, there's a new 5106 that CBP is going to be implementing that will start collecting for new importers the name, the owner name, and you can often make distinctions and connections there. And as customs brokers, if you know an importer has had prior history, trying to get this information from them before taking on new business. So some more of the best practices that I wanted to highlight in our last few minutes here. Alex had talked about how you really need to know how to update ACE. This is going to show you when you have special ADCVD values. Solar panels is a good example where part of the goods are subject to anti-dumping, part are not. There's a link on CBP's website that gives you full instructions on how to do this so that you can make sure you're separating the line items on the 7501 correctly. To the extent that you haven't done it correctly, you mentioned earlier post-summary corrections. This is an example. Again, there was a CSM message that was sent out on the proper procedure for doing this. If you don't modify your entry, your 01 entry, you do risk a liquidated damage claim for not making the proper entry on the 03 type. And so you do have to be mindful of keeping up with this. And I would encourage you to, for the brokers on the call, to actually take a look at this in more detail to make sure they're handling that process correctly. We had a couple questions about the reimbursement statement. This is your best practices, again, from the CBP website on how to handle the blanket statement. Yes, you do not have to collect paper. You can do a blanket update in ACE for the reimbursement statement, and important to note that it is only needed for anti-dumping, not for countervailing duty, unless the cases are attached to one another. It may require you get it for both. The other thing about HTS flagging, it's important for you to kind of touch base with your ABI vendor, because we've noticed that some of our customers are querying at the 10-digit level and missing sometimes when the HTS from Commerce Instructions is only at the 8-digit level. We also have some customers who have been customizing their ABI software on the country of origin, because what happens is, like the solar panel case from China comes in, and you know, you think, oh, well, if it's not China, it's not subject to it. And so this warning message of ADCVD may be required won't come up, but technically that's not accurate because of the solar cell issues. So you want to be careful and mindful of that. And then Sandy Cody, who's our ACE guru on our ADCVD Working Group, also mentioned that if you really want to query an HTS to know how ADCVD applies, you can't just rely on your ABI, but you can do a query there, and then you can go to the CBP website and tools or DOC websites to find out more about that specific case.
And again, as I mentioned, that HTS are not dispositive, that written scope of the order is dispositive. So even if the HTS doesn't show up, it still may be subject to ADCVD.
Right. So I link for you here all of the different ACE best practices and the reports that Alex had referenced earlier, so that you can see those. And again, the due diligence that you mentioned, there's some tools. If you're looking at an importer of record as a customs broker, you can go through the Reasonable Care Compliance Guide checklist. You can use the Broker Known Importer program, which has a detailed questionnaire. These are searches as a surety that we often do. Just a Google search or Google Earth search sometimes just tells you basic things about the company. I know this is something CBP has recently discussed. You'll find that importers are at the same address and they keep sending up a new company over and over again, right? And if you just Google their address, you can see that trend. A bond query that you can run can also share a lot of information about an importer's history, as I showed you earlier. If CBP is making a request to increase the bond, if there's gaps in coverage, often there can be reasons why. And then it comes down to, well, what if I'm an importer of record here in the U.S.? How do I vet my suppliers? Well, you need to make sure that they're keeping up with those questionnaires. You need to make sure that you're looking at you know, site visits, or if not site visits, making sure that they're not getting involved in transshipment, being clear on, you know, using the rates and the hierarchy of a producer versus an exporter of record. All of this really impacts you. Importers also can go to the focused assessment program, where there is a lot of detail on anti-dumping. I show you in these sections. Even for brokers, CBP highlights what are some of the red flags when it comes to dumping, what are some of the best practices, what are the documents that they're reviewing. This whole risk assessment, they ask specific questions about anti-dumping. I encourage you to, you know, take a look at that more and use it with your anti-dumping customers as well as the suppliers. So just quick in summary, it's important to remember what stage of the investigation you're in, how the product is in scope, how stable the margin is, if there's any origin or transshipment issues, being informed and making sure your ABI software is up to date. You can also rely a lot on your surety to do a financial review, because many times compliance does not equal financial stability to be able to pay some of these surmountable duties that come to play. And it's not always the you know, the bad importer that's out there. We as surety see a lot of good importers. One of my stories is I have a really good importer that brings in ribbons from China, and every year that importer is compliant. They provide their financial statement. They're meeting their obligations, and that is a win-win when we can all work together in that kind of environment. So these are links to where all of the documents are that you can find. And I also want to put a push for the NEI's GTEC conference coming up in August, where we're going to have another outreach, which is going to involve HSI, CBP, and the Department of Justice to show you the total investigations. And we have a couple more questions that we'll answer here and then get back to you with more information if we didn't get to your question. So there was one question: if we discover a couple of months after importation of multiple goods under a Type 01 entry, is the correct process to request cancellation of the entry and refile as a Type 03?
You have a couple options. One, you can do a post-summary correction. You also can do a prior disclosure as well. And so you should really consider, what works best to get the correct information to CBP and to protect yourself.
Another question, does Customs under the CDSOA Continued Dumping and Subsidy Offset Act of 2000 still provide annual distribution of ADCVD to affected domestic producers?
Yes, it's still effective for entries that came in prior to October 1st, 2007. So the entries that are liquidated and collected in those entries annually are still being distributed, and all the information on the CBP website.
Okay, and then another question here. Do you have an example of product engineering that would be an illegal method of ADCVD avoidance?
Product engineering may or may not be illegal. It's that basically they're changing the product to get it outside of the scope. May or may not be illegal depending on the circumstances.
There was a question, can we access the previous webinar with DOC? We are working on that, on either hopefully releasing the recording or doing another one for people who missed it. There's another question here. We've got about a minute left. If ADCVD flagging at the 8-digit level is a known cause of compliance issue, why are they not replaced by the full 10-digit HTS code in ACE?
Basically, Commerce, as I mentioned, populates the ADCVD case information, and so there's over 325 cases in there right now, and at some time in the past it might have gone in as 8 digits, and also they might not be able to change it if that's what they report in their Federal Register in the scope language either. But again, as I say over and over again, the written scope of the order is dispositive, not the HTS.
Let's see. Well, I think we're going to have to end it there because a lot of these other questions that come in are much more specific to specific cases, and we'll have to get information about them. And what we do is we get a down list of all the questions, and we see who asked them so we can come back to you for further clarification on those of you who had specific cases that you want feedback on. So I want to thank everyone for joining us today. And make sure you get a copy of this presentation to review the information, and I know that you'll also get CCS credits when CC has a time to do that. So thank you for joining us today, and thank you.